Hey there, this is Victoria Bartholomew. We're at 1302 Madison Street. I actually am the owner of this house as of yesterday. I paid $119,000 for it, and it needs significant renovation. So I wanted to show you all the difference between what a house looks like when it was renovated versus before that happens. As we're looking at the exterior of the home, this is what we kind of call a vernacular Italianate style house. It doesn't have significant features that makes it an Italianate besides the era that it was built, and the length of the windows tells us a lot about it, along with the large brackets on the outside of the house. Usually it's hard to find a house that is one strict style. There's usually a mix between things. So we kind of see some alterations as time goes on, and that's kind of the fun mystery of old houses. One thing that's kind of important on this age of a house is we always have this big front porch. So it was much more important then. You always knew your neighbors. You always had a sidewalk. Walkability is so important. This house is in Diamond Hill, which is one of my favorite neighborhoods ever. One of the things I love about it is there's large stone sidewalks and you can walk to downtown. So our downtown is revitalizing really quickly. And walkability is something that I think is just becoming more and more important as we go forward. So let's go take a look inside. We have steep steps up this way. It's nice to have some sitting off the street so you're not looking directly at it, but again, you still have this big veranda up front, along with the kind of intricate detailing, which almost has some Gothic influence in the railings here. That's kind of an interesting and unique design. We don't see a ton of that around here. There wasn't a whole lot of Gothic revival style architecture built around here, but there's definitely some influence in this house. As we go in the front door, we have this kind of two split window system here, which is classic of this time. And along with that, something that is very, very special is the original doorbell still works. Oh, there we go, which is super fun. Come on in. All right. So one of the unique parts about this house, and is tells a lot about the age of it, is there are pine floors in here when you first come in. As you hit kind of 1900s to the 1920s, you generally see a lot of oak, but traditionally around here, pine trees are very common, and so that's what it would have been used in the kind of wide plank flooring as we went forward. But a little point of interest, I had my carpenter come over here because we of course want to keep this amazing historic staircase, and when he was working on it, he discovered that this is actually all walnut. That's very unusual for this area. We don't have a lot of walnut, period. And so the plan is to strip this paint off to expose that. I think kind of an interesting point too to make is, although I love historic homes, I love unpainted woodwork and especially restoring unpainted woodwork. This house, of course, is built before 1978. It's built almost 100 years before that. Lead-based paint is a very real thing. It's always important to take precautions and know what the risks are with old houses. There are way more rewards that outweigh the risks, but to be prepared for when you're doing restorations that you don't accidentally hurt yourself when really you're just trying to do something really cool and good. Ceilings in here at least 10 feet tall. Again, that kind of goes back to you need to have airflow in these houses. There's no air conditioning. So you need to be able to have the cool air down at the floor. You need the hot air up at the ceiling. All these doorways have transoms, so you again have that airflow as you go from room to room. It's going to be very important. This size of woodwork is amazing. This is not something we would ever have now. That it's almost the width of my hand. If you tried to put that in now, a contractor would laugh at you. It is super important. All the doors are completely solid wood. That's something that's almost unheard of now. And we have a lot of our original hardware where you have these porcelain knobs and then the metal around it. Those sometimes get broken over time, so when you see them in place, it's really, really cool. We're walking into what would have been originally the parlor in the house. You notice that it is not totally open. That is not what is normal for these houses. And again, we have pine floors in here, and there's a fireplace in almost every single room of this house because that was the original heating system in the house. In Lynchburg and in Virginia, kind of in general, we see a lot more coal-burning fireplaces originally than wood-burning. This one, of course, has been closed off because it was a rental for a while, and so they didn't want anyone lighting fires in it. But the plan is, of course, to expose that, and then you at least have the space to either do gas logs or just kind of keep it decorative. I think another thing that's kind of interesting to point out here is almost all these walls are plaster. Plaster is beautiful, it's wonderful, it adds an interesting texture to the whole house to begin with, but things can happen to it over time. As a house settles, you can get cracks. If you get water, you can get cracks. This is kind of an example of what can happen there. We have a leak upstairs that's going to have to be fixed, and so you get kind of this cracking, and you need someone who's actually specialized in that field to fix it so that it will blend in beautifully with the rest of the house. All right, coming back in to the main foyer area, we're going to start kind of putting together the mystery story of an old house. So almost all of these were built just a couple rooms over each other, and then they're expanded over time. And kind of putting together the mystery of that is part of the fun of owning an old house. So you have a door here, which actually goes into a room that's now been opened up. So that door kind of doesn't really mean anything anymore. But what it does tell you, and it does tell people after you own it, is this is what would have traditionally been the entrance point to this space. It's very, very likely that this door would have been shut off, and you might have only had entrance to it this way. Another kind of interesting point here, this is the only room in the house that has oak flooring, which wouldn't have been traditionally done when the house was built, but maybe 30, 40 years later, which tells me either somebody did a cute little renovation at the turn of the century, which they totally did just like we do now, and they wanted to do something special in their dining room. Or this room was added on during that time, which is certainly possible, as the rooms behind it are newer than that. I think it's also kind of an important time to point out the exposed brick fireplace. So right now we see a lot of people wanting to expose brick. It's really nice, it adds warmth to a room. I totally understand why you would do it. But that is never the way they originally intended. That is a much rougher look than they would have ever wanted in these houses. Everything was very pristine, exact, custom made, so all of that would have been covered with plaster. If there is ever an exposed brick that was meant to be shown in a historic home, it is usually the hard-pressed brick, which usually has a glaze on it. This is not that. This is a rough brick that would have been hidden behind the walls, so that you would have never actually seen it. If you like it exposed, great, you can keep it that way, but otherwise, if you want a more traditional look, then actually plastering over it would be the more traditional thing to do. Coming into this room, someone at some point opened this up, which definitely makes the space more livable for now. But that is not, of course, the original intention of the room. It's a huge room, so it's honestly kind of nice to have that openness, but again, not the original integrity of the room. You get a better idea on what an actual traditional cover more looks like on one of these coal-burning fireplaces. And again, there's a chimney, there's a brick chimney behind here. You can hear the difference in it between, and that is, of course, still covered with plaster as opposed to the one in the dining room. You can see we pointed out a little bit outside, but what kind of like leans this house more Italianate is the size and proportion of the windows. So I'm 5'4". This is a big old window. It makes a big difference, there are blinds on it, but it keeps historic houses bright and light and makes such a big difference when you live in here. So it's not just the high ceilings that make it feel bigger, it's the light and it's the windows that kind of keeps the space really wide and open, which I really love. And again, you can tell the difference between the flooring in this room and the other room because you have the wide plank pine again, as opposed to in there where you have the skinny quarter-sawn oak, which is just really interesting. All right, and finally, we're going into what is now the kitchen. It's a possibility that the original kitchen in this house was not attached to the home. A house of this size definitely had servants. The servants likely didn't live in this home, although we see that a lot in these houses because there's no obvious servants' quarters and there's no basement in this house. So it's very possible that the original kitchen actually was not attached to the home. However, we have a kitchen now that definitely needs to be renovated. And I think that is one of those points where when something is clearly not original to the house, what can you do to add value to the property and also not pretend that something existed here when it probably didn't before? So changing the kitchen, maybe add a little modernization here where it traditionally probably wouldn't have been attached anyways, might add some value to the property that really doesn't hurt its historical integrity to begin with. And with that, that's 1302 Madison Street. Obviously it needs some serious restoration, but the price that it came with and the location that it's in is just to die for, and I know that the transformation is going to be huge for the house, for the neighborhood, and also just for the continual existence of its history.